Revisited. I am Karakura Gold, your host of this series in which we will be reading every single chapter of the Bleach manga, providing critical analysis of the art and narrative, personal response to the chapter, and discussion for how this chapter connects to the rest of the series. As usual, we begin these videos with a reading of the chapter that we are currently on. This is Chapter 73, Axe Storm. Ugh. Ugh. Ho 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 ho! Whoa. Ho 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 ho! I think he's laughing. You're not bad. Good. It's been decades since anybody blocked my axe. All right then. Today, I won't hold back. Good luck, boy. You're only the third person that ever blocked my first swing, but nobody's ever stopped my second move. Bleach, Chapter 73, Axe Storm. Good, you're still standing. But there's more. Take this. Juppon Jidanbo Matsuri. Jidan, 10 Strike Festival. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What's going on? 7, 8, 6, 8. Time to finish up. 10. Why? How come you're still standing? He's standing. Ichigo's still standing. Ichigo! Are you done? Then it's my turn. Not yet. I have another move. A second axe? Here goes my final move. Banzai Jidanbo Matsuri. Jidan Banzai Strike Festival. Sorry, I gotta bust your axes. Fragment. Are you? Unlucky. And that is it for Chapter 73 of the Bleach manga. Pretty quick reading, obviously, lots of 2-page spreads, more than I think we've gotten in any single chapter so far, which is fitting, but we'll talk about that whenever we talk about it. Let me get back to the beginning of the chapter here, and we can start discussion of both the art and the narrative, right? So, immediately, I like that we come off of exactly where we were before. Sometimes, transitioning to a new chapter can be an excuse to jump somewhere else in scene. So they could have brought us to the Shinigami on the other side of the wall, hearing all this clanging and battling, and wondering what's going on, and come back, or something like that to kind of build the tension. But I really do like here that we jump back to this immediate moment, because it's still a very powerful moment of Ichigo again with just the one arm blocking the sword. Are blocking the axe, the blade of Jidanbo. And yeah, I think it's just as powerful as it was then. We have a really, again, great visual arc here with Ichigo coming from the corner of the page, arcing really well into his weapon, whereas Jidanbo is just this kind of large mass that, in a lot of ways, I really like that Jidanbo is kind of equated with the wall itself. That he's often as wide as the wall is depicted, as tall as the wall is depicted. That he is the obstacle as much as the wall itself is. um, I love that, of course, we start to see Jumbo sweat, but then he gets amused, and I think that surprises Ichigo here. And again, we really get like this arc. We can really start to see Kubo's artwork start to really shine. I think the first couple volumes, they have some really great moments, but we're starting to see both that kind of more cartoonish, or I guess iconic. And whenever I say iconic, it's more simplified. It's less real to how people actually look. So I guess I'll take a beat here to explain a little bit of just depiction in comics and in art in general. Is that you tend to decide stylistically kind of where you want to fall in how you want your characters to be depicted, like how much you want the imagery to be iconic or evocative, like icons, versus how realistic you want them to be. So it's you might have seen this, kicking around online. You might have come across this in the actual book if you've studied any of this. But like, the idea that you have this kind of scale between something like a smiley face, which still conveys the sense of a face, to something like the way that Ichigo's face is drawn here, which isn't entirely realistic. Obviously, there are simplified details, like in his eyes, different planes of the face aren't exactly expressed, but it's still more realistically depicted and shaded. And so I think that's one of the things that Bleach kind of does throughout the entirety of its story. That as Kubo kind of develops as an author, he not just becomes more sort of familiar with depicting these characters in a more anatomically correct way, and also playing with that in a lot of ways too. But also, he tends to develop his style to be more realistic and less iconic. I mean, and whenever I'm using iconic, I mean as icons rather than as like these sort of things that are recognizable, independent of what they're evoking, if that makes sense. Because obviously, iconic, this is where it gets to be a little fraught using that word, is because iconic can both mean, representative of a thing, right? Like it is an icon. So obvious, like this depiction of Ichigo reminds of a person, right? We could see this image and we could say, oh yeah, that's a guy, even though it's very clearly drawn and simplified to an extent. um the other use of iconic, the other synonym for that is kind of a symbol that you can recognize even without having that sort of context. Like something that has permeated culture. Not that it's particularly visually evocative of the actual thing, and like the other use. I mean, obviously that's why the word is used both ways, because it's still, both are kind of, speaking towards you having the sense of the thing. But I mean, you don't have to read any Superman to know what Superman looks like, or know what Superman's symbol looks like, or Batman, things like that. Those characters have permeated culture in such a way that they have become iconic, right? Same thing with, like, the image of like a raised fist against oppression, things like that. There are these symbols and these images that have become icons, and so therefore they are iconic, right? And that's not the way that I'm talking about the art here. Whenever I'm talking about the art here, and I mention it being iconic, at least in this moment. I mean, I think Ichigo certainly is an iconic character for shonen manga, but that's besides the point. Um, Whenever I'm talking about the art here, I solely mean in the terms of the simplification of the line work and the depiction of these characters. And basically, essentially, I don't think one is better than the other. I think that you can have a very, very polished, kind of more simplified and iconic style, or you could have an incredibly kind of detailed, realistic style. What's important is what you want to convey. And I think that's the big thing with Bleach, is that as it develops, I'm fine with it developing that more realistic style because the story becomes a little bit more fraught and mature, and that style tends to accompany it. Those darker shadows and that more work of shadow helps to kind of, again, mirror the shadow that gets cast across the story. Uh, anyway, so it'd be weird to see the characters become more cartoonish as things go along because it doesn't quite fit. Um, One of the series that I think is fantastic for this, notably, and I'd recommend maybe starting with the Dark Horse printing for it. But if you ever read um, Usagi Yojimbo, it's an American comic. It's probably one of the longest ongoing comics written by a single author, illustrator, letter. He does all the work on it, Stan Sakai. It's phenomenal, by the way. I highly recommend that. But he does a very good job of transitioning the main character from having a kind of iconic, simplified look to whenever things get serious, having a much more detailed sort of expression and being drawn in a more detailed way. And I think that transition that he's kind of established that stylistically really works within that work, but it's not really something that you could do so much in Bleach. Though we do see it here and there, where we see like chibi versions of characters or less detailed versions of characters, both whenever they're used as little like props for a gag or you know, things like that. And I think that's the whole idea, right? Is that you can use simplification versus extra detail to really sell a moment. And I think here we see a lot of that extra detail put in because we're really selling the gravity of this moment, the severity of this kind of moment. And so we get that extra time spent. And we're going to see a lot of that throughout the Soul Society arc. And I really appreciate it. Really, one of my favorite things about Bleach are these really cool, striking moments, and this is a great one with Ichigo versus Jidambo and him blocking the axe and later coming to shatter it. Again, really wish I had a manga reader that could show 2 pages at once. Of course, the title of this chapter, Axe Storm, clear reference to the barrage of axe attacks that is coming down upon Ichigo. And I think, to a lesser extent, I could see this as also being reflective of evoking that sort of rain motif, right? The idea that it's not just like Axe Barrage or Axe Festival or something like that. It's Axe Storm specifically. I think the use of the word storm works to kind of bring us back to this idea that the rain is often connected with Ichigo's trauma and him able to stand up to this literal storm, this thing that might destroy somebody, speaks towards his growth here. Not necessarily character growth in terms of like, oh, he's become a stronger individual, haha, but like his growth in terms of actual power within the series, that he's able to weather this storm rather than be drowned through it. Anyway, do love that we immediately get Jidambo kind of laughing as he's found himself a challenge, and I gotta figure. I think this is a pretty cool moment for characterization for him. Obviously, we get the sense that he's been on this wall duty for 300 years. He hardly gets to ever see any action. You're a character that can kill 30 hollows with a single swing of your axe. Maybe there's not a lot that can really provide threats or excitement to your life. And I wonder how much, Jidambo as a giant really gets to integrate with the rest of the Soul Society anyway, That's the thing that I had to wonder about is like, we have this sense that yeah, there are giants, but like we haven't really seen them walking around in the Seirete so far yet, right? This is our first depiction of a giant within Bleach, not counting, of course, the Minos Grande, but that's entirely besides the point. So it's curious, it leads us to wonder exactly where the Giants' place is socially or societally, and I gotta figure it's not a great one, at least from everything that we know about Soul Society so far. So this actually is a pretty great moment for Jidambo, in that he actually gets to have this moment of joy. And here, whenever I say more iconic, you can see immediately like the difference between the way that Ichigo is depicted here at the bottom panel versus here for this gag, right? That he's drawn in a more simplified manner, and that helps to sell the kind of comedy because we know that we're visually indicated that this is a less significant moment. But I like that even the force of Jidambo's laugh is able to like send Ichigo sort of back a little. And even to further sell that, I like that we get the shot of the gag from outside, and we have little sweat drops, of course, on all of our other characters. As they're like, "Wait, he's laughing? Okay." um, I think it's a solid moment. I hope that's Jidambo's finger. Anyway, we come here, and I like again that we get this kind of really imposing. I mean, this is a huge panel to show just Jidambo's expression and face as he starts to take this fight a little more seriously. And I like that, we get this very evocative, "You're only the third person that ever blocked my first swing, and nobody's ever stopped the second one." And so, you know, again, that helps to reiterate this idea that over the last 300 years that he's been guardian of this gate, nobody's broken through this gate, right? And so there's been three people apparently, right? And this is he's the third, Ichigo's the third. So there's been two other people who have tried to breach this gate and have been capable of blocking that first attack. I'm curious, maybe what their story might be. But yeah, this is another really, I think, fantastic panel. I love the way that we read down through the sweep of his arm and then to like the larger kind of form of Jidambo here, and then we get Ichigo kind of parallel up against that. I think is very effective. I also like here the choice to use Zangetsu completely white, even though we know it's a black blade, but depicting it completely white to show it in juxtaposition to Ichigo to really draw attention here to the sword itself. And I like that, it sort of almost becomes the dividing force of this panel more than even the like are close to the actual panel divide. And so the sense of its sharpness or its capability of literally dividing things is presented here, right? It's good stuff. Um, and yeah, again, very great, serious kind of depictions of these characters. I think the shading on Ichigo is fantastic and on point. This is a great. I love this chapter cover. We get this really kind of smug-looking, confident Ichigo. I like that we get to see the scars that he got from the encounter with Byakuya there. That they're still present, and Kuma's still kind of aware of how he wears those wounds. I love getting to see Ichigo in his Shihakusho, and then also the way that Zangetsu is presented, and Ichigo kind of, having this real attitude look as he's got this kind of laid back, just I'm holding my arms over my weapon on my back. It's really gives us the sense that Ichigo is this real badass character that is in charge of this chapter. The fact that we're getting Ichigo on the cover of this too, for Axe Storm definitely helps us understand that this isn't really going to be a threat for Ichigo. This is going to be a chapter where Ichigo probably shines, right? And yeah, again, we come back to the aftermath of this, that he's crashed down his axe, and of course Ichigo has blocked it. And I like here, even less significant than the previous block, we just get that little kind of shred of seeing him there. So it's become even less of a significant event that Ichigo is able to block these, and therefore we know that these attacks maybe aren't, even though they're these huge, phenomenal kind of strikes for Ichigo, they aren't these, full page events anymore. Um, of course, we get this extreme, chopping several times kind of bit. I do like that Jidambo kind of loses count. Uh, that he doesn't expect anyone to survive that sort of attack, and I think that works as a gag, but also I love that we get this very kind of imposing Jidambo, and he takes up a lot of space on these pages, which helps to build this anticipation of like, okay, what's Ichigo gonna do? What's Ichigo's response? We're seeing so much of this very large and overwhelming Jidambo, but we're not getting so much of our protagonist. And of course, the same goes for the other three characters that we have in our main squad here. Technically four. Not a lot of Yorichi in this chapter, notably. But it makes sense for the friends to be kind of worried, and Yorichi maybe a little less. But I like that they're also in the same place that we are, that they are also kind of just hearing and witnessing this clash, but they're not sure of what's going on with Ichigo. This being a little overwhelming for Jumbo, I think is funny, because I guess he often doesn't have to swing more than once. and we'll get a little bit more of that whenever we go forward, and he pulls out the other axe and kind of struggles with the heft of it. So yeah, he lifts his weapon and comes down for the finishing strike. I like that he cleaves it against the side of the gate here, which is pretty wild. I think it speaks one towards this sense that he's almost frenzied with striking at Ichigo, but I also really like the next page that follows. This, I think, is a fantastic panel. Like the all of the sort of wind, all of that dust kind of spiraling around him as he has this spiral to his character, pulling the axe up towards us. Really sells the momentum of this strike as it comes up, and then we get this panel from below with him holding the axe on high behind him, and then this carve down. And again, I think this is another time that I wish that I had 2 pages to show at once, because we do get this spread of all these that barrier that he got getting sliced straight in twain, all these rocks flying, and I love that we get this cut of Jidambo over the top of it, and he's absolutely surprised that Ichigo has completely blocked his axe, and this is a great shot of Ichigo. Really, really, I think fantastic. Of course, we get the sound effect, the big doom sound effect to sell this as a really cool moment. But yeah, just holding Zangetsu there the way that he does, having, we will come to see the kind of spiral of dust, or of kind of wind, or whatever it may be, smoke, whatever you want to call it, being really significant towards showing these characters as powerful, being kind of given this almost like a halo around the ground, if that makes sense. But I love the way that this all kind of sweeps around Ichigo, and he's able to really be front and center on this page. I think it's a fantastic follow up to that 2-page spread that we got of that massive attack from Jidanbo. And I like that the flow of the kind of cloth coming off of Zangetsu too really sells maybe the motion of this, that he pulled it around, he had it above him, right, and then he pulled it around to the side here. I think that's cool. Of course, not seeing Ichigo's expression also sells this as a moment where we don't know exactly what's going on in his head. We see him as this sort of ominous force, even. Of course, that terrifies Jidambo, and rightfully so. And I like that that's juxtaposed immediately against, the way in which, now that Jidambo's cut through all the stone, Orihime is able to see him, and is able to take heart in the fact that he is all right. So I like that, like, we get this stretch from Jidambo and immediately this relief from Orihime, and I love the quick kind of interplay of the two. And I like that, of course, we come back to Ichigo, and he's got this very, very serious expression, asking if Jidambo is done. Like, that he's just kind of entertaining this sort of encounter, rather than it being an actual threat. I like that he then, of course, comes back with "It's my turn," which is a great line, especially after having endured 11 of these attacks from Jidambo. And Jidambo sort of panics and then pulls out a second axe. And this is where I really feel like this probably isn't Jidambo's Zenpakuto, if he even has one. I gotta imagine he does, given that he's got the Shihakusho and he's trusted as his gate guard. But you know, he pulls out this other axe, and like, so there's this moment where Ichigo had reflected before, like, the only things that can really hurt Soul Reaper should be hollows and Zanpakuto, and so therefore Uraharu's cane, or his cane sword, shouldn't be able to actually do damage to him. And then, Uraharu reveals that it's a Zanpakuto, and Ichigo's like, oh shit, he can hurt me. And I think the significance of that is less like, oh, okay, only hollows or Zanpakutos can hurt, a Soul Reaper. Instead, I believe the way that you're meant to read that earlier bit is that, Urahara is in physical form right there. He's Kishi, right? And so a physical object shouldn't be able to hurt a spiritual Kanpaku, right? A being made of Reishi. So like throwing a rock at a ghost isn't going to do shit. But a Zanpakuto, even in its physical form, can affect that of a spiritual entity. And the same thing goes with a hollows. I guess they're entirely spiritual energy and entities altogether. They're entirely made up of reishi. So here I don't think, because everything here in the Soul Society is made up of reishi, because these are all Kanpaku, that isn't the case anymore. So rocks can hit them and hurt them here because they're not actual physical rocks. They're rocks made of reishi. And so, on whether or not this is a Zanpakuto, and you could then be like, well, if it's not a Zanpakuto, how could it hurt Ichigo? It's like, well, because it could still be a weapon made out of reishi, right? It doesn't have to actually have been formed from Kishi physical kind of matter. And it's a weird distinction to kind of get into, and I think that's one of the things that I think Bleach sort of maybe struggles with a little bit, or at the very least, as a reader, it can be easy to have difficulty parsing between the fact that there is this sort of spiritual domain and this physical domain, even if the two are pretty divorced early on. As that line starts to bleed over more and more, it can leave people really like with a lot of questions that have clear and obvious answers, but people get like thrown for a loop anyway. It's like I remember always seeing things in comments like, what these guys are ghosts, and like how are they like bleeding? Is that like real blood, or is it like some manifestation of their reishi? What's the deal? It's like, no, it's blood. It's just that like they exist in the spirit realm. That's it. Like they can still bleed out. It's they follow all the same laws that we do. It's just that they're made of a different kind of matter, basically. That's all. Um, and obviously there are some different rules, like you can create footholds on the air in the reishi, uh, all things like that. But by and large, this is kind of like, okay, well, it's still going to follow the same sort of rules. It's just, now that we're in Soul Society, the really important thing to remember is that everything is reishi, that there is no physical matter here in terms of thinking of things as in the material world. So everything in this world can be taken at face value, Like that's ultimately what I'm coming from this here. So like if you see anything in the Soul Society, assume that you can take it at 100% face value. If a character's bleeding, that's their actual blood. They're actually bleeding. They're gonna bleed out. So on and so forth. That we don't have to worry about that distinction between spiritual matter and physical matter anymore in this arc, at least. But I know that can trip a lot of people up, so that's why I bring it up. I love this very imposing kind of stance for Ichigo that we've been seeing Jidanbo constantly throughout the entire last two chapters from this lower up perspective, where Jidanbo's really been looming down over and taking up a majority of these panels. If we go back, like, let's just track it through this chapter, and you can easily see this turnabout. Where here we're looking at Jidanbo from the ground up. We're looking at Ichigo from like a perspective of if we were standing side by side of him, right? And that helps align us with Ichigo. That helps us really see Ichigo as he's our equal. Jidanbo is this big, huge other sort of threat that is looming over us, right? And as we go throughout the page, Jidanbo consistently is the largest thing on page. He takes up the most panel space. We're seeing him from below. Every time that we can see Ichigo, we're either looking down on him or looking at him from a level plane, right? Same thing here. We're getting Jidanbo kind of looking down. We're looking down on like a smaller Ichigo. We're looking up to Jidanbo here, looking down at Ichigo. And oftentimes also Jidanbo keeps getting aligned towards the top of the page, with Ichigo towards the bottom. Of course, I love, again, chapter cover, seeing Ichigo straight on, finally getting to see Ichigo take up more than half of a page so far in this chapter. But again, this is the first shot that we get of Jidanbo from above, and I think it's really to sell this arc of the axe coming down. And I like that it's, we get this arc that comes down into this panel. But again, smaller Ichigo, Jidanbo from the ground up. Again, these shots of Jidanbo being large, but here you even get the sense of him kind of shrinking in size, even if he's taking up a huge part of the page. And as those attacks start to wither and not really strike true, we get a smaller and smaller Jidambo presented from straight on. Here, even whenever this is his largest finishing sort of move, and it is this really big windup that I love, on the page, this could have been a whole page of just his windup, but the fact that it's depicted so small on the panel, and that we get Jidambo from the front forward, that even does a lot to kind of sell the fact that Jidambo isn't quite as powerful as we were first kind of perceiving him. Now we do get this huge 2-page shot of the effect of this attack, but it's less to sell Jidambo's strength. If anything, Jidambo is just in these kind of 2 panels, sort of huffing puffing and being surprised. He's given as much weight on this page as maybe even Orihime or less. And then the real star of the show shows up, of course, Ichigo. And here we see him taking up the full page, being front and center. And from this point on, really, Ichigo starts to take up more space than Jidambo. And I like that visual sort of transition here. I think that's something that's maybe easy to miss, or something that's subtle and sort of you could maybe pick it up subconsciously. But I love that, like, the idea that you want to depict your characters in a certain way whenever you're depicting this sort of conflict, and you're thinking about how I'm going to show this and really show the tables turning. I think this is one very effective way of doing it that doesn't spell it out entirely, but is very visually sort of strong. And I like that we get these kind of smaller shots of Ichigo and this zoom into a very serious expression for him to juxtapose really hard against Jidambo's expression at the top of the page. And then finally we come to this page where we see Ichigo from the down up, the same way that we've been seeing Jidambo. There's no reason for this perspective of Ichigo logically here. Like, none of our characters are positioned like this relative to Ichigo. So this perspective shot only really works for us as the viewer to see Ichigo as this larger-than-life, very imposing sort of figure. And, of course, it's no surprise that with a lot of those Jidambo shots, we got the shot of his arm holding the weapon, and here that's what we're getting with Ichigo. So the roles have been reversed, right? And I like that Jidambo tries to kind of then reverse it again by drawing another axe. And this moment, I think, one, does a lot of things for me. So, I speculated before whether or not this might be Jidambo's actual Zanpakuto or not. I think the fact that he pulls out 2 of them still doesn't rule it out from being his Zanpakuto, technically, but the fact that he struggles with the weight of them, I think, does. So, I believe, and I don't know if it gets explicitly told to us later, but I believe that one of the big things that gets expressed, or at least visually expressed, is that the Zanpakuto for its wielder is weightless, basically. That it doesn't have, you don't struggle to wield it because it's an extension of yourself. And so I think here this Jidambo kind of struggling to raise these huge stone axes above his head, I think really kind of sells them as this external sort of weapon that was made for him to use, and maybe he's not really trained in the use of a Zanpakuto, which is fine. I'm curious what a Jidambo Zanpakuto might be. I love, it's very minor, but I really do love this moment as he lifts both of his arms. He had this shielding kind of left arm, but as he picks them both up, all of the armor snaps off of his right arm, and then we've got just both arms up. And I like that, this page is very Jidambo focused. It doesn't ever have him being too huge. We see him from above, shot on, and then even in this huge moment where he's supposed to have these 2 axes raised, poised to really destroy our character, it's relegated to like a fourth of the page, and it's not even sold as like this big menacing us looking up at him so much as it is from kind of the side. I think that's really effective. This is what I would be talking about for like what I would expect, right? As these axes come down, but this moment, we know that this isn't going to end well for Jidambo just because of how Ichigo is depicted. That he isn't sort of struggling in this moment, that he's just straightforward facing this overwhelming adversary. And really we get the sense that this is the greatest strength that Jidambo can muster, and Ichigo is unflinching in the face of it. And I love that Ichigo is as much the focal point of this moment as Jidambo is. And of course, here we get that ultimate kind of return from Ichigo, where Ichigo gets to have his own personal 2-page spread. And I love this kind of swirl zoom in into Ichigo just saying like, "Sorry, I gotta bust up your axes," right? And again, we know that Zanpakuto can be destroyed, but I also hesitate to really say that these are Jidambo's Zanpakuto, because it must really be something like it makes more sense that he could shatter something that's not a Zanpakuto. Like, we know that shattering Zanpakuto is something that can happen, that it's happened to Ichigo at the very least, but it's a pretty significant kind of event, and I don't know that we would raise Ichigo to being like the strength of Byakuya quite yet, right? Even though we know that before Ichigo and his weapon getting destroyed, as revealed by Urahara, is kind of because Ichigo doesn't know how to manifest or wield that power appropriately. But yes, I love that we get this huge sort of 2-page spread of Ichigo coming to cleave through these axes, and we get the shattering of the axes uh, here, and a lot of this is really focused on this like batting aside, basically this big axe strike that he's got both of these axes that he was coming to swing in with, and you really get them shattering and the pieces flying forward, and I really wish that I could show both pages at once. I do, like, part of me wishes that the action on Ichigo's part was maybe sold a little bit more. Like, I wish there was a little bit more dynamicy to his own posing here. Um, but I also really like that it is kind of like him just, from straight on, like, raise your right hand and swat it, down to the left. It's like him swatting a fly or batting something out of someone's hands. So I do like that aspect of it. It's just it's a little funky to read on page on initial view for me. That's all. And again, I think that Zengetsu's design here really works wonders in that we get to see a little bit of that motion, given the cloth wrapping from behind, kind of fluttering around that other side of Ichigo, and then we also get this huge. I love here really selling the just absolute magnitude of his blade, doing it as this sort of white cleaving. And in a lot of ways, that also helps to draw our eye through the image, right? So we have this essentially, his Zenpakuto more or less here creates a large arrow that is pointing towards the action of this spread, which is, of course, the shattering of these axes that we brought up through. So, kind of visually, just as far as composition goes, this is a fantastic spread, and probably one of my favorite ones so far in the entire series. And then, of course, love this in between where a fragment of the rock clocks Uryu in the face. Uh, is pretty funny. But yeah, that's essentially that is this chapter. I do really like this chapter. I think you could tell exactly from how into it I was getting that I love the kind of visual depictions of the power here, that we really get to see Ichigo coming into his own and really being confident in his power. I think that's one thing that maybe gets understated a little bit, is that whenever Ichigo's wielding his power, certainly he has moments where he has a lot of conviction versus moments where he's doubting himself or where he's unsure, where he's struggling. And I think this is a really high point for Ichigo's own conviction. And that, like, I like that, we have this really kind of even touching moment here where we maybe get the sense that Jidambo feels some sort of connection to these axes that he has part of his name sort of imprinted upon, and that Ichigo has this sort of moment of apologizing, right? That despite wielding this power of his, he realizes that he's going to have to use it to sort of destroy and strike down this other character that doesn't seem that malicious in the grand scheme of things. So, I like that Ichigo is able to show a little bit of his humanity and a little bit of his consideration for even an enemy here. And I think that's fantastic. One of the things that I really like in Bleach is the idea of, whenever we're looking at these antagonists, we can still consider them as human in different ways, and that, like, even with hollows, like there's still a human aspect to them. And Ichigo and Orihime especially do a lot to kind of see them as like human and as, not like, sure, they might be their enemies and they might have to defeat them for whatever reason, but they're still considerate and they still see the humanity in them. I think Orihime even more than Ichigo, certainly, and to her own risk. But compare that to a character like Byakuya, who clearly looks down upon people, are and like really embodies that kind of seeing humans and them as lesser, not worthy or whatever, like really that all that soul society sort of rhetoric that we've been getting a lot of. Are look at our Quincy Archer, or Ishida, who doesn't even he is literally deleting hollows. He considers them to be monsters, and he also has a lot of contempt for the Shinigami as a whole, and is unable to really see them individualistically until he encounters Ichigo, right? So I do really like those aspects of our characters, and that we get to see a little bit of that connection and humanity shine through even here in this chapter that is otherwise about a really cool big fight. But yeah, I think this is a fantastic first showing. It really demonstrates the power that Ichigo has obtained, and like a lot of also that control, right? That here we get Ichigo kind of blocking and taking his time to assess the situation and attack as he needs to. So, very different depiction of Ichigo than what we've gotten so far. Very Ichigo in control, Ichigo very powerful, and I love that. And I love that our other characters are audience to that as well. It really helps align us with the rest of the group. It really helps us feel like we are a part of and participant in this action. And it sells the action as something that is both spectacle for us, the viewer, but also for everyone else involved, right? That is this very meaningful event within the world of the story. And Ichigo's cool as shit, so I'm fucking kick ass. But yeah, all in all, very good chapter. One of my favorite ones so far, honestly, as far as both art and kind of narrative beats go. Obviously, it's not as emotionally resonant as some of the other earlier stuff, but I think that's fine. Not every one of them has to be, Shakespeare's maelstrom of emotions, right? I think this highlights what really appeals to a lot of people about Bleach is these characters being cool and triumphant, and this sort of this back and forth between these struggles, and of course these larger than life sort of supernatural encounters too. And I think whenever I mention that, I do want to reiterate that this is one thing that might throw people off for this next arc, is that so much of that first 8 volumes of that Substitute Shinigami arc is focused on these like more small scale sort of personal encounters, right? Um, and that like sure, we're dealing with the supernatural and all of that, but it seems a lot more kind of grounded and also juxtaposed against the kind of daily school life and urban sort of backdrop. And so I could see how somebody might kind of have issue with transitioning to Soul Society, where we are in, sure, it's still an urban backdrop, but it's a spirit world, and we're having these really huge, larger than life sort of battles with these kind of increasingly wild powers. And so I can understand how somebody might not like this arc of Bleach compared to what they were really sold on with the first arc of Bleach. So if you have those sorts of grievances, if you really prefer the first arc, if you really like the Substitute Shinigami arc, and you wish that we maybe got more of that instead of transitioning into what Bleach would become, especially with the Soul Society arc, let me know. I'm curious, kind of the insight that people have, and the context that people bring to it. Personally, I really like all those aspects from the Soul Society, or from pre-Soul Society, from the Substitute Shinigami arc, but I really do like the direction that Bleach takes. I think it's an effective direction. I think it's ultimately what Kubo really kind of wanted to do with the series, but all of that earlier stuff kind of helped build to these moments, and I'm grateful for that juxtaposition, because it helps me enjoy the gravitas of these moments even more, right? It's easy to forget Ichigo and his friends as coming from, Karakura High School, as a bunch of 15-year-olds, as these people that were struggling in these very personal kind of hollow battles, to the larger than life sort of huge battles that they get involved with the Shinigami and Soul Society, all of the kind of powers they develop, and how that ends up playing out. And so, yeah, I think, ultimately I like that transition. I like that amping up, that building to this larger sort of supernatural narrative. But I also can understand how that might feel like a betrayal to some people, right? Especially if all the hints at the Soul Society stuff, all that stuff that was kind of building up and leading us to being interested and invested in the Soul Society plotline that's been going on from chapter one with Rukia, that might not have been something that people have been, either one, picked up on, or two, really cared that much about. So, because, for me, I was always interested in those elements, and I always wanted to kind of see payoff for them, and I was really glad whenever the story went in that direction. It could have always been sort of just background, sort of window dressing, world building, that sort of thing, and I would have been fine with it. But I'm glad that that got payoff and that became a major part of our story, especially with Rukia, one of our main characters, being a denizen of the Soul Society and a criminal of the Soul Society. So I love it. I like that what it does for like the larger themes and everything. I don't know how long you could really sustain a story off of, just the stuff that we were dealing with in the Earth world, but it could be doable for sure. And you don't have to have a 700 chapter manga to have a really great manga. Some of my favorite manga are only around 100 chapters. So I could see that story working, and I could see it being efficient, and I could see it really, being fantastic. But the pace of it, one, would have to change significantly, I think, for it to really work for me. And also, it would have to be handled differently from the beginning outward. Anyway, that's it for my analysis and discussion of this chapter, as far as the art, the narrative, and my personal response go. But let's get into spoilers and how this connects to the rest of Bleach, because there is a little bit that I want to talk about here. Not a ton, but a little bit. So I do like that, of course. I reflected on the fact that this is probably not Jidambo's weapon, and I definitely don't think it's a Zenpakuto, which, this beginning stuff of Bleach really raises a lot of questions for me, and ones that I feel like I have answers to in general, and I'll try to kind of navigate that. But a weapon made for a person that isn't their Zenpakuto is fine. Like we know that there are, clan weapons that are Zenpakuto, but we know that there are other kind of weapons and devices and things within the society that aren't necessarily Zenpakuto. And I think maybe, whatever Jidambo's Zenpakuto might be, if it's not his axes, then maybe it wasn't fitting to his duty as gate guard, and these axes were made for him specifically as the gate guard. And it could be even that they just didn't want to forge a fucking Asuichi for a giant. Like maybe he doesn't have the Reiatsu for an appropriately fitting blade. There's a lot of questions about that, right? So yeah, like I could definitely see, like, obviously he has a Shihakusho, which we come to learn that is an invention as well from the Zero Division, right? So that isn't an inherent sort of thing to being a Shinigami, though it does kind of end up becoming a core part of their identity and a part of their power. Uh, so I kind of I think about, like, right, the sort of trappings of the Shinigami, like the Zenpakuto, the Shihakusho, and later on in this arc we would even see where Hime and I think even Uryu put on the Shihakusho to kind of fit in, right? To kind of go undercover. So it's not like it's tied individually to any one person. Clearly, it could be worn by somebody else, even if it's, obviously, as we've come to learn with Ichigo's Bankai form, whenever it kind of transforms his whole look, it's still very intimately connected to the individual and their own Ryatsu. So yeah, it's kind of strange. Like, in the same way that I guess, a Zanpakuto is very intimately connected to an individual and their own Ryatsu, but a Shinigami can be killed and their Zanpakuto can be dropped and then somebody else can pick it up. Case in point, Kenpachi with the Asuichi that he picked up, which assumably was another Shinigami Zanpakuto that they had poured their spirit into and had this direct connection to. And so I think part of what makes those inventions important is that they link with the soul of the person and become intrinsically tied to their soul, so that whenever Ichigo goes into his Shinigami form, whenever his Kanpaku is knocked out of his body, it makes sense then that he manifests immediately his Zanpakuto and his Shihakusho, because they're intrinsically tied to his Shinigami powers, even if they are external inventions made after the fact in the history of things. It's a weird bit of kind of lore and world building to reconcile, like because the way that those things get handled can feel contrary to the descriptions that we get later, but I think they all work ultimately at the end of the day. You just have to kind of reimagine and reconfigure the way that you consider them. But maybe that's me giving Bleach a little bit too much credit. I don't know. Anyway, this idea that, Ichigo's the third person to block that swing, but nobody's ever stopped the next one. So we definitely get the sense that, yeah, there have been other intruders here, but nobody's been able to kind of stop the others. So Jidambo's this undefeated sort of opponent, which I think does fit him having no wounds. But I was trying to think of, if we have any context for those previous sort of invaders or that conflict, because I was definitely thinking about Spirits Are Forever With You and as a Shiro and the fights that he has with the different various Shinigami. And I'm thinking about some of maybe the Turn Back the Pendulum stuff and a little bit of the conflict that was happening there. But we know for a fact that, like, there were these war with Quincy before, so it's curious. I wonder exactly who these other people might have been. It's not something that I need an answer to, but it's because they were defeated by Jidambo. Who gives a fuck about them, right? Ah, ha, ha, ha. But it's still the sort of thing that is, I think, evocative and interesting. And I mean, like that. I think that's the big thing. Is, again, with Bleach, we have a lot of these moments that are very sort of directly sort of evocative or granular in that way. Like, oh, okay, who were the two other people who fought Jidambo? But that's not important really to the story of Bleach at all. It's not significant as far as Ichigo's journey goes. Like, those people's identity doesn't matter in regards to Ichigo until it needs to for the plot, and then they can show up. So I'm fine with it. I think that's one big thing that kind of differentiates me from some people that read fiction. I always see this from time to time. Is you'll have people that'll read something and they'll be like, "Oh man, way to really drop the ball. You never followed up on all this cool stuff that you built up. This could have been really great, but you did all this sort of these hints at this larger sort of thing, but we never got to see any payoff for all of this." And it's like, we get to see payoff for tons of stuff. Like, this whole Soul Society arc is payoff for stuff that we've been building up for 70 chapters. But I think the thing is that, like, those sorts of people want answers for every little thing in a world. They want to have everything explored. If it's given space on the page to breathe and be evocative to them, they want it explored. And so, you have to really, for that kind of reader, what works for them are more like books that do kind of go into all that spare them those extra details, that are much more focused in their narrative. Whereas having a really rich narrative that has all those evocative details but doesn't need to go into them because it's still focused on the character's story, like Bleach, I think tends to run afoul of those people. I see this a lot in a lot of different fandoms, and it always throws me for a loop. I'll actually bring a completely unwarranted example, but Steven Universe, I think, is one where people always complain about how much better it could have been, or how it should have explored X, Y, or Z, or why didn't we get to see this, or that. And a lot of the epilogue series for Steven Universe, the extra season that they did called Future, so Steven Universe Future, really focuses on, like, narratively the fact that you don't need to be a part of all of that you don't need to see all of those things, that part of becoming a mature adult is not being a part of every single other person's life and being beholden to all of those things. That things are going to happen externally to you, and, like, that's okay. And that went over so many people's heads because, story wise, that's also what the story was doing. It was having all these other kind of elements, but what's important is what are the journey that our main character kind of goes through. And I think that's the same case for Bleach. What's important for Bleach is Ichigo's journey, right? The whole tell of everything that he goes through and how that impacts the universe at large, but also all of these kind of connections that he makes along the way, and all of that. Like, the really Bleach is the story about how the individual can affect the world, right? And I think that it's great and it's fantastic and it stays pretty focused on Ichigo's journey, but it does evoke a lot of other things in the world. And so you can wonder, who are all the members of this division? I wish I would have seen more of this division. I wish I would have seen more of the Hollows. Like, what was life in Hueco like under Barakin's rule? Okay, now I guess Hallibel's the queen of the Hollows. Do they have, like, an election? Like, what is even going on there? What's Hueco like now? What were all the Quincy doing for 1,000 years? Like, they're just there. What's the deal? Like, okay, obviously there are a lot of these sorts of questions, and there's a lot of, these moments that aren't focused on, because if they were, then Bleach would be like, it'd still be running. You know, you've got to tell a story at the end of the day. Like, that's the important thing. And I think that's the thing that ultimately that I appreciate, is that Bleach cares most, first and foremost, about telling its story and about keeping its focus on Ichigo. And I think the places where, or at least Ichigo's journey, I mean, obviously we focus on different POV characters at times, but, like, I think the parts where Bleach works least for me is whenever that focus is a little muddled. I think there's moments in the Arrancar arc, especially, or Hueco Mundo and all of that, where it feels like that focus is a little lost, and I think that ends up being probably the weakest arc for me in general, because of that like that sense that, things start to kind of meander and there's that little bit of loss of focus. And I think I felt that more watching the anime than I did the manga, because the manga, at least, at the time I was still reading it weekly, so it's like, another chapter of this, huh? You know, I was really ready to get it forward, but then the problem was, like, we kept having these new characters introduced and put into fights, and it was like they hadn't been really given time to breathe or feel significant even. So, there were a lot of problems with that, and I'll get to, like, my misgivings of that whenever we get to those parts, but all in all, I think Bleach does manage to keep its focus throughout, pretty well, and that's going to come at the issue of course, having this highly evocative world. Despite that, and I think some people are always going to want more of that and not be just satisfied with their own imagination and coming up with their own answers, but they will feel like it was some failing of Kubo Tights or of Bleach to answer those things despite setting them up. And I personally will never read that as a failing. I will always read it as, if you made me think about this fictional world more, if you put something in it that is interesting enough for me to, like, want to think about it, then that's fun. That's the entire enjoyment that I get out of fiction, is that I get to imagine these sorts of things and that you have sparked that imagination within me. And so never will I begrudge an author for sparking that within me. Now, I can maybe give them a hard time for handling those things poorly after the fact, but I will always appreciate, those evocative sort of moments of those sort of rich kind of character and world moments that make me really kind of imagine a grander sort of thing to this narrative. Whenever all that really exists in any fiction at all, but it's even Bleach, is what we have on the page. There's nothing more than that. I mean, obviously, there's like, well, what about the story in Kubo's head? It's like, well, then he has to make it up, and it doesn't really exist in Bleach until it's on the page, right? So, you know, as far as, like, the actual literal facts of the story, all we get to see is what's on the page. What's evoked is our sort of moments of us being, having this connection to the narrative and being able to bridge those gaps. I mean, manga in general and comics as a form have us co-author them. As we look between these panels, we're able to read the action because our brain fills in the space between those moments, right? We're able to see one panel of the character raising their weapon, another panel of their weapon being on the ground, and us imagine that as a strike and the weight and everything to it. And the same thing goes for narrative. We're given all these points of reference, and then we can imagine the connections between them. And if a story is effective, it allows us to imagine those points in a more clear method. But nevertheless, we are still doing some of the heavy lifting ourselves. It's why a lot of people, I think, prefer the book to the movie, generally whenever it comes to adaptation. It's because, with a movie, everything's concrete. You're given less moments to really fill in what you want personally. Whereas with a book, you can fill in a lot of what you want personally, right? So, Also, a movie's always going to have a difficult time adapting a book because a movie is, you know, it's you only have so much space on screen. In a book, you have pages and pages and pages to go into detail, and so the two forms are kind of at odds with one another anyway. Get into media forever. Let's continue to talk about actually connections from this chapter. I did just go on an entire tirade about, Bleach and its effectiveness as a story and what's evocative here and there, and it's connected, but there is more to talk about specifically in this chapter. And I think the biggest thing here is, of course, Ichigo sort of coming back and having endured this attack, shattering Jidambo's weapons, right? That he breaks those axes. And I think also the really, I think, other significant thing that's maybe easy to overlook is this is probably the first time that we get a Shinigami character really calling out the name of an attack. We usually associate that with, like, obviously we've gotten Kido before, and I guess we've gotten, like, Hal Zabimaru, and we've gotten a few things from Urahara too with Benihime, right? But here in Soul Society, this is the first time that we've gotten, like, a couple different kind of attacks with, like, specific names to them. And so that's kind of cool. That would be something that we would get throughout Bleach, right? As a character has these huge kind of pages where they have some sort of big significant technique. We'll definitely revisit this with Byakuya, right? Like, Byakuya has quite a few. So, I do think that is pretty cool, but also this shattering of the weapon ends up being pretty significant throughout all of Bleach. Obviously, not just, Jidambo's weapons getting shattered isn't that significant, but the idea of a character breaking another character's weapon is something that we would see a lot. And that we saw, obviously earlier, that it is entirely this moment of defeat for Ichigo and this place for him to grow. And it consistently for Ichigo, anytime that his weapon gets broken, it's a place for him to kind of grow and develop. It's he goes to the whole Squad Zero and trains and actually learns the true nature of his blade. And then later, whenever Yuha is able to destroy his blade, Bach, Yahweh, the final boss, however you want to pronounce his name, Quincy King. Whenever that happens, Orihime is able to reject the event, which I think is pretty clever. But this idea of shattering one's weapon, and I talk a lot about, I spend good detail and length going into the significance of the actual physicality of these people's weapons, and I think the destruction of them is just as significant as their sort of form and function as well. So this being the moment that Ichigo really wields power capable of destroying another person's weapon, right? I think that's really significant, and it's worth considering. Of course, I think the other kind of neat thing is here the two times that we've seen Ichigo wield Zangetsu in this really effective sort of manner. It's been drawn completely white in these ways, which is wild because we typically consider it as like this black blade. It shoots the Getsuga Tensho, that is this big black kind of fire, and yet here we've seen it as a pure white sort of blade in these moments of clash, and I think that might be evocative of Old Man Zangetsu's Quincy sort of power flowing through, but I don't know, I could be wrong. It could just be a stylistic decision, because I think it does stylistically work here as well. But I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. Always interested in what you have to say about any of these connections, or if you see any other connections that I didn't really pick up, please do let me know. As always, thank you so much for getting through this entire video. Thank you for watching this entire hour-long endeavor. I really do appreciate it. And if you have gotten this far, go ahead and give the video a like to signify that. Especially if I pointed out anything that you weren't aware of. I think you owe it that much. And, if you want to bring the discussion further, I am always looking forward to engaging with people in the comments section. As always, this is something that you can continue to support me with if you subscribe. You'll put this in front of more people on YouTube. It really helps out. But even furthermore, you can support me on Patreon. As low as $1 a month, you can help me out and help the channel grow. And the link for that is in the description for this video, as well as all the videos that I upload within this series. And on screen right now, you can see everybody that is currently supporting me on Patreon. Thank you so much for that. I really do appreciate it. It means the world to me. Without further ado, I say without further ado like I'm going to introduce anything. We're closing this video. Anyway, take care, folks. Thank you so much for watching. As always, this has been your host, Karakura Gold, reminding you that spirits are forever with you. Stay gold.